When my parents vowed to destroy my career unless I transferred my deed to my brother, my lawyer laughed, and I found my freedom. Their ultimate downfall shocked our whole family. I am 34 years old, and for most of my life, I operated under a very specific, quiet delusion. I truly believed that if I just worked hard enough, achieved enough, and stayed entirely out of the way, I would eventually earn my place within my own family. It is a harsh and bitter pill to swallow when you finally realize that in some families, love is not an unconditional bond. It is an economy. And in my family's emotional economy, I was born completely bankrupt. I work as a senior real estate agent in the greater Boston area, a career built entirely on understanding the psychology of shelter, investment, and human behavior. Every day, I help clients navigate the anxieties of buying and selling the places they call home. It is deeply ironic that it took me over 3 decades to understand the toxic foundations of my own. I grew up in a seemingly picture-perfect, middle-class suburban house. If you drove past our neatly trimmed hedges and the fresh coat of paint on our porch, you would think Gordon and Cynthia had built the quintessential American dream. But inside those walls, there was a very clear, rigid hierarchy. My brother, Trent, who is 2 years older than me, was not just the favorite child. He was an investment. From my earliest memories, Gordon and Cynthia treated Trent like a blue-chip stock. All the family's emotional and financial resources were funneled directly into him. I, on the other hand, was treated like a background asset, something that merely existed in the periphery, quietly maintaining itself without requiring any actual attention. The disparities were not always explosive, but they were a constant, suffocating undercurrent. I call them microaggressions of favoritism, and they add up over a lifetime. When Trent struggled with middle school math, my parents immediately hired an expensive private tutor who came to the house twice a week. When I asked for help with my chemistry homework 2 years later, Gordon barely looked up from his newspaper and told me to figure it out or walk to the public library. The message was explicitly clear. Trent's success was a family project. My success or failure was entirely my own problem. The contrast became impossible to ignore as we got older. When Trent turned 16, the driveway suddenly featured a brand new, shiny sedan wrapped in a giant red bow. He crashed it into a mailbox less than a week later, scraping the entire passenger side. Gordon and Cynthia just laughed it off, calling it a rite of passage for young men. When my 16th birthday rolled around 2 years later, we had a small dinner in the kitchen. Cynthia handed me a heavily wrapped box. Inside was a set of used, slightly stained cookbooks and a floral apron. She smiled her tight, practiced smile and told me that a young woman needed to learn how to manage a household and serve her future family. I remember staring at those cookbooks, feeling a heavy, cold knot forming in my stomach. It was not just a terrible gift, it was a declaration of my worth. Trent was given a vehicle to explore the world. I was given instructions on how to stay in the kitchen. My parents attended every single one of Trent's high school baseball games. They bought the overpriced team merchandise, sat in the front row of the bleachers, and screamed themselves hoarse, even though Trent spent the majority of his senior year sitting on the bench as a backup outfielder. They had hundreds of photos of him in his uniform plastered all over the living room walls. Meanwhile, I channeled every ounce of my isolation into academics. The school library became my only safe haven. I joined the debate team, the science club, and pushed myself to the absolute breaking point to secure straight A's. When I won first place in the state-level architectural drafting competition, a moment I was incredibly proud of, I looked out into the auditorium hoping to see my parents. They were not there. They had skipped the state finals because Trent had a regular season, inconsequential baseball game in the next town over. When I brought my gold trophy home, I placed it on the kitchen counter. Cynthia moved it into a dusty corner cabinet an hour later because it was cluttering her meal prep space. That is when the realization finally settled in my bones. I could discover a cure for a major disease, and it would still rank second to Trent successfully tying his own shoes. The college years were when the financial reality of my family's favoritism truly revealed itself. When Trent graduated high school with remarkably mediocre grades, Gordon and Cynthia took him on tours of private universities across the country. They paid out of pocket for a costly out-of-state tuition, covered his fraternity dues, paid his rent for a party house off campus, and gave him a generous monthly allowance so he could, in their words, focus on the college experience. When my turn came, the conversation was brief and brutally transactional. We sat at the dining room table, and Gordon informed me that times were tough and they had stretched their budget thin for Trent. If I wanted to go to college, I would need to figure out the financing myself. They said it would build character. I spent my senior year of high school aggressively applying for every scholarship I could find. I eventually secured a substantial academic package at a respectable university in Boston, but it only covered tuition. To pay for my cramped dorm room, my textbooks, and basic groceries, I had to work. I did not just have a part-time job. I lived in a constant state of exhaustion. I worked 3 jobs simultaneously. I opened a campus coffee shop at 5 in the morning, smelling like roasted beans and stale milk before my first lecture. In the afternoons, I restocked shelves at the university library. But it was my weekend job that changed the trajectory of my life. I got a minimum wage position filing paperwork and answering phones at a boutique real estate brokerage downtown. That office became my real education. The owner of the brokerage, a brilliant, sharp-witted woman named Diana, noticed that I never sat still. If the filing was done, I was reading old contracts. If the phones were quiet, I was studying property listings and neighborhood comps. Diana became the mentor my mother never was. She started pulling me into her office during quiet afternoons, teaching me the intricacies of property values, zoning laws, and most importantly, the psychology of high-net-worth clients. She taught me that people do not just buy wood and brick, they buy security, status, and a vision of their future. For the first time in my life, someone looked at me and saw potential, rather than an obligation. I survived college on 4 hours of sleep a night and cheap ramen noodles. I watched from afar as Trent took 5.5 years to complete a basic business degree, switching majors 3 times, all on Gordon's dime. My graduation day should have been a moment of triumph. I was graduating near the top of my class with honors. I had mailed my parents formal invitations months in advance. As I sat in the sprawling stadium, wearing my cap and gown, I kept scanning the bleachers, looking for a familiar face. I had saved 3 seats near the front. They remained empty throughout the entire 3-hour ceremony. As my name was called and I walked across the stage, the silence from my section of the crowd was deafening. I walked out of the stadium clutching my diploma, feeling a profound, hollow ache in my chest. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from Cynthia. It read, "So proud of you, honey. Trent came down with a mild summer cold and your father, and I need to stay home and make sure he rests. Let us know how it goes." A mild summer cold. That was all it took to erase 4 years of my literal blood, sweat, and tears. I did not reply. I walked to a cheap diner near campus, ordered a slice of cherry pie and a black coffee, and celebrated my college graduation completely alone. I promised myself sitting in that vinyl booth that I would never, ever rely on my family for anything again. I would build my own fortress, brick by brick, and I would make sure no one could ever take it away from me. The next 10 years were a blur of relentless, unapologetic hustle. While my peers in their early 20s were out partying and finding themselves, I was working 14-hour days. Diana hired me as a junior agent the day after I got my real estate license. I did not have family connections or a trust fund network to tap into, so I built my client base the hard way. I hosted open houses every single weekend. I cold called expired listings until my voice gave out. I learned to read a room the moment I walked into it, understanding exactly what a buyer was afraid of and what they desperately wanted. My bank account grew steadily, but I lived like I was still a broke college student. I drove a reliable, used sedan, lived in a tiny 1-bedroom apartment, and poured every spare dollar into a high-yield savings account. I was aggressively saving for a down payment, not just for a house, but for independence. During my methodical climb up the corporate ladder, I had a front row seat to Trent's spectacular, slow-motion failure. Gordon and Cynthia's golden boy was crashing hard into the reality of the adult world. Trent could not hold down a standard job for more than 6 months. He constantly clashed with managers, claiming he was too smart to be taking orders. So, Gordon decided to fund Trent's entrepreneurial spirit. It was a textbook case of the sunk cost fallacy. Gordon had invested so much identity and money into the idea that Trent was a genius. He could not stop throwing good money after bad. First, there was the sports memorabilia shop. Gordon co-signed a massive commercial lease for a storefront. Trent stocked it with overpriced jerseys and spent his days playing video games behind the counter. It folded in 8 months. Next was a tech startup. Trent claimed he was developing a revolutionary food delivery app. Gordon liquidated a portion of his retirement portfolio to hire freelance coders. The app never launched, and the money vanished. Finally, there was the drop-shipping phase, which resulted in my parents' garage being permanently filled with thousands of cheap, unsellable plastic phone cases from overseas. Every time Trent failed, Cynthia would aggressively spin the narrative at family holidays. She would say the market was just too hostile for young, innovative male entrepreneurs, or that the economy was entirely to blame. Never once did they acknowledge his utter lack of work ethic. Then, Trent met Sloane. Sloane was introduced to the family as a social media influencer, which was a polite way of saying she posted heavily edited photos of herself at expensive restaurants and had a few thousand followers she likely paid for. She was exactly what Trent wanted, a superficial accessory who validated his massive ego. They dated for 7 months before announcing their engagement. The wedding was a financial bloodbath. Gordon and Cynthia cashed out even more of their savings to throw a lavish, 200-guest country club wedding that looked like something out of a reality television show. There were ice sculptures, a live 10-piece band, and Sloane wore a custom designer gown. I sat at a table in the back, nursing a glass of cheap white wine, watching my parents beam with pride as they essentially financed their own future ruin. They had paid more for a single evening of appetizers and open bar than they had contributed to my entire existence. At the reception, Gordon gave a tearful, slurring speech about how proud he was of the man Trent had become, and how Sloane was the daughter they had always dreamed of having. I remember catching Diana's eye across the room. She had come as my +1 because I could not bear to face the family alone. Diana just raised her glass to me in a silent, knowing toast. She saw exactly what I saw. My parents were completely, hopelessly emotionally bankrupt, and they were masking it by writing checks they would soon no longer be able to cash. Trent and Sloane left for a 3-week honeymoon in Europe, entirely funded by the bank of Mom and Dad, while I woke up at 6 the next morning to show a colonial property to a neurosurgeon. The divergence in our lives was complete, and the stage was set for the collision. By the time I turned 32, I had reached the level of senior agent at Diana's firm. I had a corner office, a roster of wealthy, loyal clients, and a savings account that represented a decade of sheer discipline. I was finally ready to buy. But I did not want just any property. I did not want a cookie-cutter new build in a sterile subdivision. I wanted a home with bones. A home that had survived history. Because in my mind, if a house could stand strong for over a century, maybe it could teach me how to do the same. The house found me entirely by accident. I was doing a routine neighborhood appraisal when I noticed a stunning, slightly neglected Victorian home nestled behind overgrown oak trees on a quiet, historic avenue. It was built in 1890. Even with the peeling exterior paint and the overgrown ivy choking the porch, it was magnificent. It had a sweeping wraparound veranda, intricate gingerbread trim, and a slate roof. I looked up the public records and saw it was owned by a retired university history professor who had lived there for 40 years. It was not on the market. But in real estate, you learn that everything is about timing and approach. I wrote him a handwritten letter. I did not use corporate letterhead. I used heavy, cream-colored stationery. I told him I was a local agent, but I was writing to him personally. I expressed my deep admiration for the historical integrity of his home and told him that if he ever considered selling, I would want to be the one to preserve it, not a developer looking to gut it. A week later, he called me. We drank tea in his incredible, dust-filled library. He told me his wife had passed away a decade ago, his children had moved to the West Coast, and the house had simply become too much for an 80-year-old man to maintain. He showed me the original hardwood floors hidden under hideous 70s carpet, the thick mahogany pocket doors that still slid perfectly into the walls, and the stunning stained glass window at the top of the grand staircase. As I walked through those echoing rooms, something deep inside my chest clicked into place. This was not just a piece of real estate. This was a fortress. It was vast, quiet, and solid. The professor saw the reverence in my eyes. He admitted he had received offers from developers who wanted to chop the house into multi-family rental units, but he refused to see his family home destroyed. I laid my cards on the table. I told him exactly what I could afford. It was a strong offer, draining virtually every dollar of my hard-earned savings, but it was slightly below what a ruthless developer might pay. He looked at me, smiled a gentle, sad smile, and said, "A house this old needs a guardian, not a landlord. It is yours." The day I signed the closing documents, my hands were actually shaking. I sat in the title office, gripping the pen, realizing what this meant. There was no cosigner. There was no family money. Gordon and Cynthia did not contribute a single dime to the down payment. Trent had never set foot in the neighborhood. My name, and my name alone, was printed in bold black ink on the deed. I drove straight to the empty house, unlocked the heavy oak front door, and sat right in the middle of the dusty parlor floor. I stayed there for hours as the sun went down, listening to the creak of the old wood settling in the evening air. For the very first time in my 32 years of life, I was standing in a space where I was not an afterthought. I was not second best. I was the absolute owner of my domain. The Victorian was structurally sound, but cosmetically, it was a time capsule of bad decades. The restoration process took me a year and a half. I did not hire a massive general contracting firm to come in and flip it in a month. I could not afford to, and more importantly, I did not want to. I wanted my sweat in the walls. I hired professionals for the dangerous work, updating the ancient knob and tube electrical wiring and replacing the rusted plumbing. But everything else I did myself after work and on weekends. I spent countless Friday nights wearing a respirator mask, carefully applying chemical stripper to the grand staircase, peeling away 5 layers of thick, ugly paint to reveal the stunning, original tiger oak underneath. I rented heavy, vibrating floor sanders and spent weekends wrestling them across the parlor, my muscles aching, covered head to toe in fine wood dust, bringing the century-old pine floors back to life. I ripped down awful floral wallpaper, patched cracked plaster by hand, and repainted every single room in rich, moody, historic colors, deep emerald greens, rich navy blues, and warm terracottas. I converted one of the 4 upstairs bedrooms into a massive, dedicated home office, lining the walls with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and placing a heavy walnut desk facing the dormer window that looked out over the street. Metaphorically, repairing that house was how I repaired myself. Every time I fixed a broken banister or restored a shattered window pane, I felt like I was mending a tiny piece of my own fractured self-esteem. The house was healing me just as much as I was healing it. When the major renovations were finally complete, the house was a showstopper. It was elegant, deeply personal, and undeniably expensive-looking. To celebrate, I decided to host a large housewarming party. I invited my colleagues, my clients who had become friends, and, out of a lingering, foolish sense of obligation, my family. The evening of the party, the house glowed. Soft jazz played through the speakers, the smell of catered food filled the air, and laughter bounced off the high ceilings. Diana arrived early, carrying a massive box. Inside was a beautiful, handmade quilt for my guest room. She hugged me tight and whispered how incredibly proud she was of the woman I had become. My friends filled the rooms with warmth and genuine joy. And then, an hour late, Gordon, Cynthia, Trent, and Sloane finally arrived. The energy shift was instantaneous. They did not bring a gift. They walked through my heavy front doors and stopped dead in the foyer. I watched their eyes dart around, taking in the crystal chandelier, the gleaming restored woodwork, and the sheer scale of the house. There was no pride in their faces, only shock, instantly followed by deep, thinly veiled resentment. Cynthia offered a stiff, lukewarm congratulations before immediately asking how much my monthly heating bill was going to be. Gordon walked around knocking on walls, muttering about the inevitable cost of roof repairs on historic homes. But it was Trent and Sloane who were the most toxic. They were currently living in a rented, overpriced luxury apartment they could barely afford. Sloane walked through my spacious, beautifully designed kitchen, running her manicured hand over the quartz countertops. I heard her whisper to Trent, "This is absolutely ridiculous. So much wasted space for just one person to dust. What does a single woman need with 4 bedrooms?" Trent just glared at my stainless steel appliances, his jaw tight. They stayed for exactly 45 minutes, drank my premium wine, ate the catered food, and left without saying goodbye to anyone but me. As I watched their car pull out of my driveway, I realized my success was an absolute insult to their entire worldview. By succeeding completely on my own, I had exposed the lie that Trent was the only one capable of greatness. The economic shift hit exactly 6 months after my housewarming party, and it hit Trent and Sloane like a freight train. The lifestyle they were projecting on social media was built entirely on a mountain of credit card debt and Trent's dwindling commission checks from a mediocre sales job. Eventually, the facade crumbled. Trent was fired for missing his sales quotas 3 quarters in a row, and a week later, they received a formal eviction notice from their luxury apartment complex. Because they had zero savings, they had nowhere else to go. With their tails tucked between their legs, Trent and Sloane packed up their high-end furniture and moved directly into Gordon and Cynthia's basement. It was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, just a few weeks until Trent found his footing. But weeks turned into months. Sloane refused to get a traditional job, claiming it would interfere with her brand building online. Trent spent his days sleeping until noon and sending out a handful of half-hearted resumes. The tension in my parents' house was palpable, but true to form, Gordon and Cynthia refused to hold Trent accountable. Instead, they began to deflect. And the target of that deflection was me. I maintained a strict boundary of only attending mandatory family dinners once a month. It was during these agonizing Sunday roasts that the psychological warfare began. The comments started as subliminal drops, tiny seeds of guilt planted over mashed potatoes and dry chicken. Cynthia would sigh heavily and say, "The economy is just so vicious to young couples right now. It really takes a village or a family to help people get established in this modern world." Gordon would chime in, nodding sagely, "Absolutely. Wealth should not be hoarded when members of the same bloodline are struggling to keep a roof over their heads. Family resources need to be allocated practically." I would sit there, chewing my food in silence, my heart pounding a steady, angry rhythm against my ribs. I knew exactly what they were doing. They were testing the waters. The delusion was breathtaking. Gordon and Cynthia were terrified of admitting that their golden boy was a financial parasite who had drained their retirement accounts. To face that reality would mean admitting their entire parenting strategy was a catastrophic failure. So, their warped minds began looking for a scapegoat, a magical solution to fix Trent's life without it costing them another dime. And there I was, the invisible daughter, sitting alone in a massive, paid-for, beautifully restored 4-bedroom Victorian fortress just 30 miles away. The hints grew increasingly aggressive. One evening, Sloane looked directly at me across the table, her eyes wide with fake innocence. "Nadia, do you not get terribly lonely in that huge, echoing house all by yourself? I cannot imagine rattling around all those empty bedrooms at night. Trent and I are just crawling over each other in that dark little basement." Before I could answer, Cynthia placed her hand over Sloane's. "It is a tragedy, really. Such a perfect family home, just sitting empty, while a real family is forced to live underground." I put my fork down, the metal clinking sharply against the porcelain plate. "I use every room, Cynthia. I have a home office, a guest room for my friends, and a dedicated gym. The house is exactly the size I need it to be." The table went dead silent. Trent glared at me, his face flushing red with anger. Gordon cleared his throat, his eyes narrowing into a cold, hard stare. The atmosphere in the dining room became suffocating. The parasites were no longer just circling, they were locking onto their target. I drove home that night with my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I locked my heavy oak front door, turned on the security system, and paced the floors of my sanctuary. I knew my family was deeply dysfunctional, but I had severely underestimated how far their emotional bankruptcy would drive them. The subtle hints were over. The storm was coming, and they were bringing it straight to my front door. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button to join our community, leave a like, and let me know in the comments which city you are watching from. Every comment helps spread this video to more people who love intense family drama. Thank you so much. The pressure cooker finally whistled about a month after that suffocating Sunday dinner. I was sitting at my desk at the brokerage, finalizing a massive commercial lease agreement, when my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed it was Gordon. He rarely called me during business hours unless he needed something, so my stomach immediately dropped. I answered with a professional tone, but he skipped right over the pleasantries. He launched into a fast-talking, frantic pitch about an incredible, ground-floor investment opportunity that Trent had discovered. According to Gordon, it was a massive real estate development project that was guaranteed to triple its initial capital within 6 months. There was just one catch. They needed a massive influx of cash to secure their equity stake by the end of the week. He was calling to ask me for a loan. Not a small loan to keep the lights on, but a staggering amount of money that would have completely wiped out my remaining liquid savings. Because I work in real estate, I know exactly what a legitimate development deal looks like. They require prospectuses, environmental impact studies, zoning approvals, and mountains of legal paperwork. When I asked Gordon to send me the business plan, the risk assessment, or even just the name of the holding company, he completely froze. Then he got defensive. He accused me of being a cynical, unsupportive sister who did not trust her own family. He said Trent had inside information and that asking for paperwork was an insult to his entrepreneurial instincts. I recognized the red flags of a scam immediately. It had all the hallmarks of a desperate, fear of missing out money grab. I told him, as calmly as I could, that I do not invest in ventures without legal documentation, and I absolutely do not lend money to family. He hung up on me. Less than 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text message from Trent. It was dripping with venom. It read, "You have always been an arrogant, selfish elitist. You sit in your giant house looking down on everyone else. You finally have a chance to pull your family up with you, and you turn your back on us. Do not ever ask me for anything." I stared at the screen, my hands trembling slightly, not from guilt, but from sheer adrenaline and rage. The audacity was breathtaking. They were drowning in a financial crisis of their own making, and they were furious that I refused to be their life raft. For 2 weeks, it was dead silent. No calls, no texts. I foolishly thought I had established a boundary and they had backed off. But in a family run by emotional bankruptcy, silence is never peaceful. It is just the tactical retreat before a major offensive. On a Tuesday afternoon, an envelope arrived at my office via certified mail. I signed for it, feeling a cold, not form in my throat. Inside was a heavy, formal invitation printed on thick cardstock. It was from Cynthia. It requested my presence at a mandatory family dinner the following Sunday evening at their house. At the bottom, written in Gordon's sharp handwriting, was a note that read, "Crucial family matters regarding the reallocation of assets will be discussed. Your attendance is not optional." The anxiety that hit me was physical. I felt nauseous. I knew my parents. I knew they did not use the phrase reallocation of assets unless they were planning something deeply manipulative. The days leading up to that Sunday were a blur of sleepless nights and racing thoughts. I tried to convince myself that they were just going to ask for money again, that I would just say no and leave. But my gut told me this was going to be much worse. When Sunday evening arrived, the weather matched my dread. It was a freezing, torrential downpour. I drove the 30 miles to my childhood suburb with my windshield wipers on the highest setting, gripping the steering wheel as the rain hammered against the glass. I wore a tailored navy blazer and slacks, treating this not as a family gathering, but as a hostile business negotiation. I was putting on my psychological armor, but deep down, the terrified little girl who just wanted her parents to be proud of her was still trembling inside. I pulled into the driveway and immediately noticed the sheer number of cars. Besides Gordon and Cynthia's sensible sedan, Trent and Sloane's leased SUV was parked right near the front door. But what made my blood run cold was seeing Aunt Vivian's old station wagon and Uncle Judson's truck parked on the street. This was not an intimate family discussion. This was an ambush. They had gathered an audience to pressure me into submission. I walked through the front door, shaking the freezing rain from my umbrella. The house was unnervingly quiet. Cynthia met me in the hallway wearing a dark, formal dress, her face set in a grim, theatrical expression of sorrow. She did not hug me. She just pointed toward the formal dining room. I walked in, and the scene looked like a tribunal. The long mahogany table was set with the fine china they only brought out for Thanksgiving and Christmas. Gordon was sitting at the head of the table, wearing a full suit and tie. Trent and Sloane sat to his right, looking incredibly smug, their arms crossed. Aunt Vivian and my uncle sat on the opposite side, staring down at their empty plates, looking deeply uncomfortable and refusing to meet my eyes. I took the only empty chair at the far end of the table, as far away from Gordon as possible. No one offered me a drink. No one asked how my drive was in the pouring rain. Cynthia brought out a roast, carving it in heavy silence. The only sounds in the room were the clinking of silverware against porcelain and the muffled sound of the storm outside. I could not eat. My stomach was tied in absolute knots. I pushed a piece of potato around my plate, waiting for the axe to fall. It happened exactly as the dessert plates were being cleared. Gordon wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, folded it precisely, and cleared his throat. He steepled his fingers, leaning forward, looking at me not as a father looks at a daughter, but as a corporate raider looks at a hostile acquisition. "Nadia," he began, his voice booming in the quiet room. "We have called this gathering because we are at a critical juncture. Family has always been our highest priority, and sometimes, difficult sacrifices must be made for the greater good of the bloodline. As you know, Trent and Sloane are going through a temporary transitional phase. However, they are planning to start a family soon. It is imperative that our future grandchildren are raised in a proper, spacious home, not a basement or a cramped apartment." I stared at him, my brain struggling to process where he was going with this. "Okay," I said slowly, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "I hope they find a great place when they get back on their feet." Trent let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Sloane rolled her eyes. Gordon slammed his hand flat onto the table, the crystal water glasses vibrating from the impact. "Do not play stupid with me, Nadia. You know exactly what we are saying. You are a single woman with no prospects of starting a family anytime soon. You are hoarding a massive, 4-bedroom historic estate that you do not need. We have discussed this extensively as a family unit. The most logical, ethical reallocation of our family assets is for you to transfer the deed of the Victorian house to Trent and Sloane. You will, of course, be allowed to take your personal clothing, but the furniture should remain, as they have no capital to furnish a house of that size." The room went completely black for a second. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the demand felt like a physical blow to my chest. I looked around the table. Aunt Vivian had her eyes squeezed shut. Sloane was nodding enthusiastically, a greedy smile playing on her lips. Trent looked like a king waiting for his crown. And my parents looked at me with total, terrifying entitlement. "You want me," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "You want me to sign over the house that I bought with my own money, that I spent a year and a half renovating with my own hands? You want me to just give it to Trent because he cannot hold down a job and pays for a lifestyle he cannot afford? It is not just your house," Cynthia shrieked, suddenly dropping her calm facade. "It is family wealth. You only have that career because we gave you a foundation. We raised you. You owe this family. I owe you nothing," I shouted, finally standing up, my chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. I paid for my own college. I built my own career. Neither of you contributed a single red cent to my down payment. The deed is in my name. The mortgage is in my name. You are absolutely delusional if you think I am handing over my life's work to subsidize his failures. The answer is no. Not now, not ever. Gordon stood up slowly. He was a tall man, and he used his physical presence to try and intimidate me, leaning heavily over the table. The mask of the reasonable patriarch completely melted away, replaced by something cold, vicious, and calculating. This was the moment the emotional bankruptcy revealed its most terrifying face. I anticipated you would be selfish, Gordon said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. You always were an ungrateful, stubborn child. So, let me make the reality of your situation perfectly clear. We have consulted with professionals. We provided your childhood housing, your food, and we bought your college textbooks. Under the law of equitable investment, we have an implied equity stake in your future earnings and assets. We are legally entitled to a portion of that property. I actually let out a short, hysterical laugh. That is the stupidest thing I have ever heard. You cannot claim equity on groceries you bought me when I was 12 years old. Any lawyer would laugh you out of their office. Then let them laugh, Gordon sneered, taking a step toward me. Because the lawsuit is not the real threat, Nadia. You have built a very delicate reputation in the real estate market, haven't you? You deal with wealthy, prestigious clients. Trust is your entire currency. What do you think happens to that trust when your own parents file a public lawsuit against you for elder abuse and financial fraud? My breath hitched. The room started to spin. Gordon saw the panic flash in my eyes, and he smiled. It was a cruel, triumphant smile. That is right. If you do not sign that deed over to your brother by Friday at 5 o'clock, I will personally call the state real estate board. I will call Diana at your brokerage. I will call your biggest clients. I will tell them all that you are a predator who manipulated your elderly parents out of their life savings to buy that Victorian mansion. I will file police reports. I will launch a smear campaign so loud and so vicious that your face will be on the evening news. You will be toxic. Your career will be completely, irreversibly destroyed. You will never sell a single piece of real estate in this city again. Cynthia stepped up next to him, her voice sickeningly sweet. We do not want to destroy you, honey. We just want what is fair for Trent. Just sign the papers, move into a nice little condo, and everything will go back to normal. Do not force us to ruin your life. They were going to destroy me. They were looking at their own daughter, the only child who had actually made something of herself, and they were willing to burn my entire life to the ground to shield my brother from the consequences of his own incompetence. This was not a family disagreement. This was extortion. This was blackmail. I did not say another word. I could not. My throat was completely closed up with terror and grief. I grabbed my purse from the floor, turned my back on them, and sprinted for the front door. I heard Trent yell something derogatory behind me, but I didn't stop. I burst out into the freezing, torrential rain, my heels slipping on the wet pavement. I threw myself into the driver's seat of my car, slammed the door, and locked it. I sat in the dark, the rain pounding against the roof, and I had a massive, full-blown panic attack. I could not breathe. My chest felt like it was being crushed in a vice. The career I had bled for, the reputation I had protected so fiercely, the fortress I had built, they held a match to all of it. I sobbed until my ribs ached, driving blindly through the storm back to the city, terrified that by Friday, I would lose absolutely everything. For the next 48 hours, I barricaded myself inside the Victorian. I called Diana and told her I had a severe stomach flu, taking a leave of absence for the first time in 10 years. I drew all the heavy velvet curtains, locked every deadbolt, and paced the hardwood floors like a trapped animal. The house, which had always felt like a warm embrace, suddenly felt like a target painted on my back. I was terrified. In the real estate industry, allegations of financial fraud, even entirely fabricated ones, are a death sentence. Gordon knew exactly where my vulnerabilities lay. He knew that the mere whisper of an elder abuse investigation would force Diana to suspend my license pending a review. On Tuesday morning, Desperate and feeling my sanity slipping, I scheduled an emergency telehealth session with my therapist, Dr. Clara. I sat on my living room floor, staring at my laptop screen, and poured out the entire horrific story of the ultimatum dinner and the threat to destroy my career. I was crying so hard I could barely form coherent sentences. Dr. Clara let me get it all out, her expression a mix of deep empathy and clinical sharpness. When I finally finished, she took a deep breath. "Nadia, listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice anchoring me to reality. "What you are experiencing right now is the absolute pinnacle of their emotional bankruptcy. Gordon and Cynthia are not acting out of strength. They are acting out of sheer, unadulterated desperation. They have hitched their entire psychological wagon to Trent. If Trent goes down, their entire identity as successful parents goes down with him. They are cornered animals. And cornered animals will bite anyone, even their own children, to survive. But they can ruin me," I whispered, clutching my knees to my chest. "They can call the board. They can destroy my reputation. They can try," Dr. Clara corrected firmly. "But you are acting as if you are still the 16-year-old girl sitting at the kitchen table with a pile of old cookbooks. You are not. You are a 34-year-old powerhouse. You are a senior agent. You have resources. You have a paper trail. You need to stop reacting like an abused child and start preparing for war like the professional you are. You need a lawyer. Today." Her words snapped me out of my paralyzing regression. She was right. I was letting the ghosts of my childhood dictate my present reality. I wiped my face, closed the laptop, and went straight to my home office. I pulled out heavy binders and started printing. I printed every single bank statement from the last 10 years. I printed the wire transfer receipt for my down payment. I printed the deed, the mortgage documents, and the property tax records. I printed the text messages from Trent calling me a selfish elitist. I gathered every shred of evidence that proved 100% independent ownership of my life. Then, I picked up the phone and called a wealthy client of mine who was a senior partner at a massive downtown law firm. I asked him for the most ruthless, brilliant family and property litigation attorney in the city. He gave me one name: Victor. Victor's office was located in a high-rise building overlooking the Boston Harbor. It smelled of expensive leather, strong espresso, and old paper. Victor was a man in his late 50s with sharp, calculating eyes and a demeanor that radiated absolute authority. I sat across from his massive mahogany desk, placing my 3-inch thick binder of documents down between us. I felt like I was fighting for my life. I started from the beginning. I explained the family dynamic, Trent's financial ruin, the bizarre logic they had constructed, and finally, the ultimatum dinner. My voice shook as I repeated Gordon's threat to claim an equity stake based on childhood groceries and his vow to call the real estate board and my clients to accuse me of elder abuse. I braced myself for Victor to look concerned. I braced myself for him to tell me how difficult and damaging this legal battle was going to be. Instead, Victor picked up his reading glasses, stared at me for 3 seconds in total silence, and then he started to laugh. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a deep, rumbling, genuine belly laugh. He leaned back in his leather chair, took his glasses off, and wiped a tear of pure amusement from the corner of his eye. His laughter echoed through the quiet office, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I was losing my mind. "I am so sorry, Nadia," Victor wheezed, trying to catch his breath and waving a hand apologetically. "I am not laughing at your distress, I promise you. I have been practicing law in this city for 30 years. I have seen bitter divorces, corporate espionage, and families tear each other apart over billions of dollars. But your father's legal theory is, without a doubt, the most spectacularly absurd, legally illiterate piece of fiction I have ever heard in my entire career." The tight, agonizing knot in my chest loosened just a fraction. "So, they don't have a case?" Victor slammed his hand on the desk, his face instantly transforming from amused to dead serious. "A case? Nadia, parents have a legal obligation to provide food, shelter, and basic needs to their minor children. It is called the law. Providing those necessities does not act as a venture capital investment with a return on equity in your future real estate purchases. If that were the law, every parent in America could seize their children's bank accounts. Their legal claim is less than zero. It is a fantasy. He pulled the binder toward him and quickly flipped through my immaculate paper trail. You have absolute, undisputed title to this property. But that is not the important part. He leaned forward, his sharp eyes locking onto mine. What your father did at that dinner table was not a family negotiation. Threatening to destroy your career, threatening to file false reports of elder abuse to a licensing board unless you hand over a multi-million-dollar asset, is a textbook violation of state and federal law. It is felony extortion. It is criminal blackmail. And it is highly actionable. The terror that had been suffocating me for 3 days vanished, replaced by a sudden, blinding flash of clarity. They were not all-powerful parents dictating my fate. They were criminals attempting a desperate shakedown. We are not going to wait for Friday, Victor said, pulling a fresh legal pad toward him. We are going to drop a nuclear bomb on this delusion before the sun sets today. I sat in Victor's office for 2 hours while he dictated a document to his paralegal. It was a masterpiece of legal violence. It was a formal cease and desist letter, but it was drafted with the unmistakable promise of absolute destruction. The letter clearly stated that I was the sole legal owner of the property. It outlined, in terrifying legal jargon, the specific criminal statutes regarding extortion and blackmail that Gordon and Cynthia had violated during the Sunday dinner. But the final paragraph was the hammer blow. It stated that if Gordon, Cynthia, Trent, or Sloan made a single phone call to the real estate board, my brokerage, my clients, or posted a single defamatory statement on social media, Victor's firm would immediately file a massive civil lawsuit for defamation, tortious interference with business relations, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Furthermore, the letter promised that we would forward the evidence of their extortion attempt directly to the district attorney's office to press criminal charges. We will send this via priority courier to their house, Trent's basement bedroom, and to Gordon's email, Victor said, signing the document with a flourish. When you leave this office, you will put your phone on Do Not Disturb. Do not answer calls. Do not reply to texts. If they try to show up at your house, you call the police immediately and report trespassers. You belong to yourself, Nadia. Let me handle the monsters. I walked out of that high-rise building and stepped into the crisp Boston air. For the first time in my life, I felt the heavy, suffocating chain of my family's expectations snap in half. I was free. The fallout was instantaneous and chaotic. The courier delivered the letters at 3 o'clock that afternoon. By 3:15, my phone screen looked like a slot machine. The notifications poured in. I watched them in silence from the safety of my Victorian living room, drinking a cup of tea. There were 12 missed calls from Gordon in the span of 10 minutes. Then came a barrage of unhinged text messages from Trent, calling me a traitor, a sociopath, and swearing he would make me pay. Sloan took to social media, posting a vague, crying selfie with a caption about toxic family members who care more about bricks than blood. I took screenshots of everything and emailed them directly to Victor's paralegal. The most pathetic attempt came the next morning. Despite the legal threat, Gordon tried to call my office. My boss, Diana, picked up the line. I had briefed her on the situation the night before. Gordon tried to put on his authoritative, concerned father voice, asking to speak with me regarding a mental health crisis I was supposedly having. Diana, who is a woman who eats corporate sharks for breakfast, cut him off mid-sentence. Listen to me very carefully, Gordon, Diana said coldly, putting him on speakerphone so I could hear. Nadia is the best agent in this firm. She has my full protection. If you ever call this office again, if you ever try to contact our clients, or if you ever come within 100 feet of this building, our corporate legal team will bury you so deep under harassment lawsuits you won't see daylight for a decade. Do not ever mess with my people. Goodbye. And she hung up on him. That was the last time I ever heard my father's voice directed at me in anger. The realization that their threats were empty, that they were utterly powerless against the wall of legal and professional boundaries I had erected, finally broke their campaign of terror. The extortion failed. The silence that followed was not the tactical silence of a retreat. It was the absolute silence of defeat. 6 months passed. Half a year of absolute, glorious no contact. The healing process was not perfectly linear. There were nights I woke up in a cold sweat, reaching for my phone to check for angry text messages that were no longer there. But slowly, the nervous system regulation kicked in. My career skyrocketed. Free from the constant, draining anchor of my family's emotional demands, I closed 3 of the biggest commercial deals of my life. My Victorian house truly became a sanctuary, filled with art, music, and friends who actually loved me for who I was, not for what they could extract from me. Then, as spring finally melted the Boston snow, a heavy ivory envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was an invitation to my Grandpa Judson's 80th birthday celebration to be held at an exclusive country club. Attached to the formal card was a handwritten sticky note from Aunt Vivian. It read, "Nadia, please come. I am managing the guest list and the seating chart. You will be seated at my table, completely separated from Gordon and Cynthia. Grandpa Judson explicitly asked for you to be there. You are safe." I debated going for a week. Dr. Clara advised me that attending from a place of strength, fully armored in my new boundaries, could be the final step in my closure. So I went. I bought a stunning, tailored emerald green dress that made me look like money and power. I drove to the country club, handed my keys to the valet, and walked into the grand ballroom with my head held high. The atmosphere in the room was electric with unspoken tension. I spotted my parents immediately. Gordon and Cynthia were standing near the buffet line, and the physical change in them was shocking. Gordon looked like he had aged 10 years in 6 months. His suit hung loosely on his frame, and the arrogant posture was completely gone. Cynthia looked exhausted, her usually perfect hair slightly frizzed, her smile tight and anxious. Trent and Sloane were standing in a corner, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Sloane was not carrying a designer handbag. She clutched a cheap, generic clutch, and the massive diamond engagement ring she usually flaunted was missing from her finger. They looked broken. Aunt Vivian intercepted me with a warm, fierce hug, guiding me to a table far away from the toxic epicenter. We ate lunch, and I mingled with cousins who looked at me with a newfound, nervous respect. The rumors of the legal cease and desist had clearly circulated through the family grapevine, painting me as a woman not to be trifled with. When the cake was served, Grandpa Judson stood up at the head table. He clinked his spoon against his champagne flute. The ballroom fell dead silent. He was a sharp, uncompromising man who had built his own wealth from nothing. He thanked everyone for coming, his voice steady and commanding over the microphone. Then, he put his notes down and looked directly at Gordon's table. "I have lived a long time," Grandpa Judson said, his gaze piercing. "And the greatest tragedy a man can witness is the willful destruction of a family through blind, foolish favoritism. I have watched some members of this family pour all their resources, their love, and their blind faith into a vessel with a massive hole in the bottom. And I have watched them ignore, marginalize, and attempt to steal from the only person who actually built a solid foundation." He turned and looked directly at me across the room. My breath hitched. "Nadia," he said loudly, making sure every single person in the room heard him. "You built your life with your own 2 hands. You protected your assets. You refused to be bullied, and you refused to let incompetent people drag you down with them. I have never been more proud to share my blood with anyone than I am of you today. You are the strongest person in this room." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. I felt tears prick my eyes, but I did not let them fall. I just nodded to him, placing my hand over my heart. I glanced over at Gordon and Cynthia. They were staring down at their plates, their faces burning dark red with public, undeniable shame. Trent looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him. Grandpa Judson had just validated 34 years of my reality in front of the entire extended family. Later that afternoon, as the party began to wind down and people moved out to the terrace for coffee, Aunt Vivian pulled me aside into a quiet alcove. She held 2 cups of coffee, handing me one. She had a grim, satisfied look on her face. You dodged a bullet that was meant for your heart, Nadia, she said quietly, stirring her coffee. You need to know the truth about what happened after you sent that lawyer after them. What truth? I asked, leaning in. The demand for your house, Vivian explained, her voice dropping to a whisper. It was never about Trent and Sloane needing a place to live or starting a family. That was a complete lie. Trent was involved in a massive, illegal Ponzi scheme masking as a real estate development project. He had promised the organizers a massive buy-in. When Gordon's money ran out, they looked at your Victorian house. Their plan was to force you to sign over the deed, immediately leverage it for a massive cash loan, and dump that money into the Ponzi scheme to save Trent's position. I felt the blood drain from my face. They were not just trying to steal my home, they were trying to liquidate it to fund a criminal enterprise. What happened when I refused? Vivian took a sip of her coffee. When you locked them out legally, Gordon panicked. He was so terrified of Trent facing the consequences, so trapped in his sunk cost fallacy, that he secretly took out a massive second mortgage on his own house. The house you grew up in. He dumped hundreds of thousands of dollars into Trent's scheme. She paused, letting the weight of the reality settle in. The scheme collapsed 3 months ago. The feds raided the organizers. The money is completely gone. Gordon and Cynthia defaulted on the mortgage. The bank is foreclosing on your childhood home next month. They have lost everything. Their retirement, their house, their reputation. I stared at her, the sheer magnitude of the karma hitting me like a physical wave. And Trent? I asked. Sloane filed for divorce the second the money vanished, Vivian said with a dry chuckle. She moved back in with her parents. Trent packed his car in the middle of the night and fled to another state to avoid the angry investors he recruited. Gordon and Cynthia are moving into a cheap, 2-bedroom rented apartment. They destroyed their own lives trying to destroy yours. I drove back to my Victorian house that evening as the sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the slate roof and the wraparound porch. I walked through the heavy oak doors, the silence greeting me like an old friend. The house was safe. I was safe. Gordon and Cynthia's emotional bankruptcy had finally translated into literal, financial bankruptcy. They had gambled everything on the golden child, and the house always wins. That November, I hosted Thanksgiving dinner in my formal dining room. The table was surrounded by my chosen family. Diana was there, laughing loudly and pouring wine. Dr. Clara sat across from her, trading stories. Aunt Vivian sat near the head of the table, smiling warmly. The house was filled with the smell of roasting turkey, fresh flowers from the garden, and genuine, unconditional love. I looked around the room, realizing that the greatest revenge is not anger or retaliation. The greatest revenge is simply surviving, thriving, and building a beautiful life completely out of their reach. Am I the a-hole for watching my family lose everything to a Ponzi scheme after they tried to extort my house and ruin my career, or did they simply reap the karma they sowed? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button to join our community for more intense family drama stories every single week. See you in the next video.